In 1984, I was living in Scarborough, Ontario. I didn't have a pot to piss in or the window to throw it out of, as my father used to say. I had 2 little kids, a wife, and I had just finished being Ronald McDonald for Vickers and Benson Advertising and obviously McDonald's of Canada. The contract had finished, but we had already made a home in Canada. But you can't stay in Canada on a work permit if you don't have any work. So I had to go. Well, the fates conspired, shall we say, to allow me certain advantages that really were life-changing. And foremost amongst them was this totally unforeseeable, unplanned occurrence. We didn't have any food in the house. And a neighbor, I remember she was Asian, brought a big carload of food, and I could see out from the upstairs window, and she pulled up, and her sons were carrying this food up. First of all, how did anyone know? And then, oh my God, this is just, what I felt was absolute embarrassment. I said to my wife, you go to the door. And of course, that was wonderful of her to do and really, really needed. But I thought, listen, man, you got to get something together. This can't go on like, you're here in Canada without a work permit, and the neighbors are it's so obvious that you're skint that the neighbors are bringing food to the door. So I did something that just sounds ridiculous. I looked under P for Publisher in the Yellow Pages in Toronto, put my hand down on a number, and it said Methuen Carswell Publishers. And I called them up, and someone said, Methuen Carswell? And I said, hi, my name is Geoffrey Giuliano, and I know more about the Beatles than anyone. And I have a fantastic, just a moment. She cut me off. I thought she was, click, no click. And then a voice came on the phone. Hello, this is William Hushian, CEO of Methuen Carswell Canada. Did you say that you had a book in the Beatles? No, I don't have a book in the Beatles. I said that I know, could you write a book about the Beatles? Well, yeah, that was my thinking. That's kind of why I called. Have you ever written a book before? No, but I was editor of my university newspaper, hardly a qualification. And he said, that's funny, because we were just sitting around in the boardroom thinking, there hasn't been a Beatle book in a hell of a long time. Wouldn't it be great if we got one? Because I'm sure we could sell it internationally. Are you free now? Why don't you come down? So I got 2 big suitcases of my best memorabilia and got in my beat-up old car and went down to see them. And I walked out with a check for $45,000 for world rights when I didn't have 45 cents in my pocket. And Methuen proceeded to sell it to St. Martin's Press in New York for America, and Sidgwick and Jackson to a young editor called Nigel Newton. Nigel Newton, who went on to found Bloomsbury Publishing in Soho Square, right next to Paul McCartney's office. Nigel Newton, who hired an unknown, out of work, similarly financially constrained young writer who did a series called Harry Potter. And then he went into the stratosphere. He later published another one of my books. I'll digress and tell you that I did my first book with Nigel, and then my third book was Dark Horse, The Private Life of George Harrison. And for his company, Bloomsbury, he'd only done one book. I think this was the second book. And he said to me, look, we've offered you £40,000 advance, which was in those days a lot of money, maybe still, but we don't really have it. Would you be willing to take 20% of Bloomsbury Publishing? And I said, listen, man, I'm from New York. You're not going to pull the wool over my eyes. No, I want the now. We all know that if I'd done that, that would have meant that by and large I would have owned 20% of Harry Potter, and I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you right now about nothing. So that was a kind of funny one. All right, let's go back to the story. So the book that I ultimately did, the first book, was called The Beatles: A Celebration. And it was a fucking hit around the world. And I went on a promotional tour, and I stayed at the Kensington Park Hotel in London, and I went around with a limousine, and they had promotional assistants, and I went on all the big shows, and it was the same thing in America all around, because they didn't have Skype then. They save a lot of money now. People stay home, they do it on Skype. But in those days, you had to physically go and stay, and it was the best of everything. Now, this was incredible, and it was nothing I expected. Now, I have never taken a writing course in my life, but the London Times once wrote a review of one of my 32 books and said, it's not that Geoffrey Giuliano isn't a good writer. He is. But his real talent is knowing what to write about. And they're right. Because the subjects that I have unilaterally picked for my writing have all been evergreen. The Beatles, the Stones, Jimi Hendrix, The Who. It's something that has a sustained interest and audience. So, however much credit I can take, I don't know. I think I came along at the right time. A lot of people have written to me fairly recently and said, at that time, before the internet, there wasn't any Beatle books, and everybody was hungry. They wanted, if they liked the Beatles, they wanted something to buy. And they had all the records, and then your books came out and kaboom. And it was like that first book, The Beatles: A Celebration, was a huge hit. So my second book I wrote with John Lennon's sister. Paul McCartney wrote the foreword, so that became a big deal. This particular rant is not about my books, however. So I'm going to fast forward 20 years of sitting my fat ass over at 735 East Market Street in Lockport, New York, writing book after book after book after book, and you know them and you like them or you don't know them, but anyway, that's what I did. And then one day I was sitting in, we had 3 floors in our house, and an office on the 3rd floor, and I said to my wife, Brenda, the way that, this is before the internet, the way you can type on the screen, I wonder if there's some way that you could have a book that's not a printed book, but it's somehow in the computer or on the computer. Oh, no, that's ridiculous. No one will ever replace the printed book. Monks used to slit their wrist and write the Bible in their blood. Books have been around forever. Printed books will never go away. We're fine, because we were making a lot of money. In fact, we used to have a company rule. Right over her desk, we had a bulletin board with the little pegs in it. And any check that was under $5,000, we would pin to the board and only put in the bank once a month, because it wasn't worth it to go to the bank for $4,700 or $3,500. And we waited until we, got a few. We made a lot of money, because I was really the only one in the world that was supplying. I accidentally fell into that hole of what people wanted and filled it up with those books. Well, then one day I had this Christian guy working for me. He was constantly going on about Jesus, which was fair enough. And he was a computer geek too. He came as an electrician. He said, there's this thing now called the internet. And I said, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, well, let me show you. You got a telephone jack? Sure, man, right there. So he took out his briefcase thing. He's got the Bible, and he's got all kinds of things, which I guess was a modem, a huge thing, And he plugged it in there. And some lights blinked, and it made goofy noises, and like an old sci-fi movie. And then after maybe 15 minutes of a black screen, there was a little flashing cursor. Not a word of a lie. This is almost, word for word exactly what happened. It's strange to me. I don't know. Black cursor. And he said, there it is. And I said, there's what? He said, the internet. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I don't understand. He said, let me show you. And he typed in, hello, where are you? And then we waited about another 15 minutes. And a message came. Hi, I'm fine. I'm in, I think it was San Francisco. See, you can communicate with people through the telephone line and it comes up in the computer. I didn't know that meant they were building a fucking gallows in my front yard, which they would hang me and my career in about a year. But it was the beginning of the end without any warning, without understanding at all that the stupid fucking box was going to take me from being a multimillionaire to being, well, my reduced circumstances, shall we say, here in 2019. I had no idea, but that's exactly what happened, just as my wife had predicted. The computer came and took over that thing, and I was selling buggy whips or 8-track tapes, that thing that I traded in, printed books, is now something that rich people buy in a limited edition for $3,000 signed by this or that celebrity and they keep in the coffee table. It's not the way you get your information. And I was right there on the cusp. Fortunately, this didn't happen until about my 20th book, maybe after Lenin in America, which was good for me, that book. But it happened. And nobody cared about Borders closed, Walden's books closed. And I remember I would go to New York and I would, hang with the big shots at Penguin and down in the East Village and go to lunch. And they'd talk and they say, oh, did you hear this thing about Borders maybe closing? And what is that? And Walden's books. And this was a thing that a family did in America. And they say, okay, kids, we're going to Walden's, and there's a play area for the little kids, and there's a place you can get a drink, and then there's like all the rock biographies, and you could walk around, and everybody remembers that isn't, 20. But they closed. They were the first to go. And then one day I got a letter from 375 Hudson Street, Penguin, USA. Dear, I didn't save the letter. I should have saved it and have it framed somewhere. So just as fate brought me into the publishing business, it kicked me the fuck out about 20 years later. So it was a good run. Dear Mr. Giuliano, you have been a solid mid-list author these many years. But we are, due to whatever the bullshit was, financial constraints, letting you go. And this was after 20 years. Now, I made enough money that I could have put away between $150,000 and $200,000 a year for 20 years in a retirement. But I didn't think it was going to stop. I never thought, books have been forever. They're going to stop now. And they kept calling, and the offers rolled in, and each book did better than the last. But I didn't save any money. But fortunately, I had an agent, benevolent as I see him now, who secretly paid money in, because I was self-employed, you didn't exactly have to do it, to my retirement fund with Social Security. So now I have a small check, all of which has nothing to do with the topic of this video, which is my audiobook company. Because just at the end of my career of printed books, down by the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge to Niagara Falls on the Canadian-American border, was a place that said Durkin Hayes, books on tape. We used to drive by it all the time. And one day I stopped in, I said, hi, oh, you're an author. Yeah. So what is this, books on tapes? He's not in. This is the guy, the owner. And what's his name? Cyril Hayes, God rest his soul, bastard. I'll tell you why in a minute. I brought in my books, and no, they didn't. It wasn't like there was this thing where like Paul Newman would read Moby Dick, and that thing was like a laborious thing. I do it now, but in those days I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And these wouldn't. What I want to do is like put interviews in there. So if it's about the Beatles, you'll have interviews with the Beatles and people that knew the Beatles, and what a fantastic idea. And they gave me $40,000. Turned out they sold the rights subsequently to that. smushing time together a little bit for the sake of the video. They had sold something that they paid me $40,000 to Delta Music in Santa Monica, California, to a fellow by the name of Michael McLean for $1 million. Not $1 million, it was 908, just shy of $1 million. And I had given them the rights to this, whatever, X amount. Now I've done over 350 audiobooks since then, but this was the first batch, and they made $1 million off me from that $40,000 investment. But I will tell you this, a book will normally take, and a trade book is like 100,000 words, and it's about 300 pages. It takes about a year to write one of those. You know how long it does to do a 1-hour video on John Lennon or Paul McCartney or George Harrison or Led Zeppelin? Maybe 2 weeks. From then, from my association with Durkin Hayes, I became noticed. And the Titanic movie came out. And I, being the kind of shy, retiring type that I am not, called up the biggest audiobook publisher in the world, Random House. The CEO was called Jenny Frost. And I called and I said, could I speak to Jenny Frost? And she said, this is Jenny Frost. Kind of not very nice. She said, my secretary's sick today. I'm taking the calls. How can I help you? And I knew that I had about 15 seconds to pitch this woman. I said, none of which was true. I have materials on Titanic that no one in the world has. I have interviews with the captain, the crew, the survivors, the people on the Carpathia that picked them up. I have all the... Big silence on the phone. You do? Yes, I do. The next day, okay, we want to do business. The next day, I got not a word of a lie, I got a Federal Express with a down payment of $280,000 check from Random House for a fucking book, an audio book, two cassettes. You can see it out there. Of course, it's digital now. That fateful night, true stories of Titanic survivors in their own words. And I had nothing. I had nothing but bullshit. That is the healthy degree of narcissism that I have that people like Donald Trump have way too much of. So I said to my wife, what do we do now? And then it came to pass that I understood that the BBC in London would have archival footage and tapes, and that's exactly what I did. I went to London and I paid, $5,000 or something, and I got the rights to these interviews with not the Captain Smith, but I got the interviews. I got what I need. I cobbled it together, and then there was a Titanic Association. The really old guys and a couple of the survivors in their 90s. So I interviewed them and and it what fucking nominated for Best Spoken Word Recording. And for that year, I don't know what year it was, early 90s probably, Jimmy Carter won out reading the Bible, which is fine with me. I'm a Democrat. I can live with that. But I was nominated for a Grammy for that thing. All from bullshit. But just like the books, the first book, The Beatles: A Celebration, wherein I just took the bull by the horns and just charged in there. And yes, funny you called. We happened to be looking for a Beatles book, and then 32 books later. And I did the same thing with Jenny Frost. And I made far more money from the audio than I ever did from the books. And they're a lot easier, you have to get in a booth and read stuff, and it's hot. But, boy, you sure make a lot of money. So I had it all, and I flew by the seat of my pants. And it worked out very, very well. The only place I really kind of lost the plot was not to save any money for my old age, and now I'm almost 66. That was a big mistake. But listen, when you got that kind of money rolling in, and it rolled in for really 22, 23 years, why is it going to stop? Well, it did. So that would be a regret. Now, as I sit here in 2019, I'll tell you what I did and have done and am doing. I started my own company called Icon Audio Arts. I put out probably about, I think it's 130, from that phone call with Jenny Frost, with all the other companies that I worked with, Bantam, Doubleday Dell, Durkin Hayes, Random House. And there were times I'd get just to tell you how it used to be, I would do an audiobook on Muhammad Ali, and I'd get there'd be 2 discs, I'd get $50,000 a disc. They were very picky at Random House. They'd come back with you with fixes and pronunciation, and they had every right to for that kind of money. But anyway, I did all those, and then I came to Thailand and lost the plot again. We won't go into that one. There may be children watching. But in that time period, those rights reverted back to me. So I suddenly found that I had 32 books and about 300 and something audiobooks, which we then kind of took to the studio and filtered. I'm not a production guy. They made them sound better, turned them to dot wave, I guess. I know that much. And then we did a deal with Amazon, Audible, Authors Republic, audiobooks.com. And now if you put my name in anywhere, up they come. So then we decided, well, that's the old stuff. Now let's make new stuff. So for the past 2 years now, I've been making new stuff, and stuff that's interesting to me. The Bhagavad Gita, The Prophet by Kahlil Gibran, a lot of stuff about yoga, children's things. Last month we had 187 downloads of me reading Alice in Wonderland. So, it's a kind of curious end for an old hustler to be sitting in a condo in Southeast Asia reading Alice in Wonderland in your underwear, and then it shows up on Amazon. But I get a little check and a retirement. And that's okay. I had an interesting time. And it all just came out of nowhere. In fact, one of my friends said, one of your best talents is your ability to sort of pull things out of thin air and make something out of them. And I said, every book starts with a blank piece of paper and a typewriter. So if a guy who never had a writing lesson can write 32 internationally best-selling books over 20 years, produce 300 and something audiobooks, I had some help with that, basically all by the seat of my pants, then you can do whatever you possibly don't know you can do as well. So that's the story, abbreviated not so much, of how I got started and got into the media business. By the way, when the audiobooks were done and the printed books were long done, and I found myself in Thailand, the part we're not supposed to talk about, I thought, I took my degrees as an actor. Maybe I should, do the thing that I wanted to do all along. Because obviously I'm a little larger than life, good or bad, indifferent. I don't know, I'm abnormal. We all know that. Possibly just abnormal enough to be in the movies. So the very first thing I auditioned for, which was the Hallmark Channel, the pirate movie, I did that, and I've done now 25 movies. And I played crazy man, bad man, mafia guy. I'm off to South Korea to do one soon. So I'm no big success anymore. But I'm doing what I enjoy, and I'm doing what came out of me. And that's the wrap. Peace out. I'm Geoffrey Giuliano.